So you've come to me because you want to find the most effective way to learn Linux. Now, I can give you that, and I will. At first, I need to preface this video by saying I'm not going to be teaching you how to use Linux. This isn't a tutorial. This is supposed to be a jumping off point. It gives you the information you need to know how to learn Linux. Well, that's fun. Half of school is just learning how to fucking teach yourself shit anyway. Because what's more important than just learning how to use Linux is the most effective way to learn it. Because you can jump straight into Linux, you can start doing everything you want to, but it might not be the best way to learn it. And there's a lot of information online about where to start with Linux. But the methods that people recommend, they have their problems, and it's certainly not the most effective way. So I'm here to propose an alternative that not many people do. And it won't cost you a cent, but it'll be a nice little upgrade to your current setup. You don't have to abandon Windows to do it. You don't have to interrupt your Windows workflow. This method will blend seamlessly with it. So it makes Linux much less daunting to learn, but it's also a much more effective way to learn it. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's start making those brains gains. Okay, so let's start talking about some of the methods people recommend. The more well-known ones that everyone sort of knows about, and what's good about them, but also what's terribly wrong about them that makes it hard to learn Linux. So, dual booting. A lot of people recommend this one. It's not a bad way to start off when you're learning Linux. It allows you to easily switch between Windows and Linux, so you don't have to starve yourself of Windows and drop it straight away, which is one of the most daunting things about learning Linux. For most people, I assume, is trying to move away from Windows and what you're familiar with. But other than that, there's not really much good about it. It allows you to switch. But the only problem is that you find yourself in Windows more often than you do Linux, because you have to switch between the two. You can't be running both at the same time. You're always going to be in one over the other. And when you're used to Windows and you're trying to do stuff, you're just going to go back to it, and you're not going to find any time for Linux or learning Linux. Not only that, but it requires either a separate disk or it requires you to use a bunch of space on your disk. It takes up a lot of disk space, and that's not always the best thing depending on what your personal setup's like. I know for me, I'm the kind of guy to run just small SSDs in my computers just because I would rather have the speed than the storage. So dual booting for me is not a best practice, just because of how little storage space I generally have locally. And if you are using a hard drive and you have plenty of storage space, but you aren't using an SSD, then switching between the two is always going to be slow, because you have to shut down one, boot it back up, wait for the grub menu, switch back to Windows or Linux, depending on what your preference is, and then it has to launch everything. And that can be slow, and that can waste a lot of time. So you might be messing around in Linux trying to learn something, and then you've got shit to do, and you want to switch to Windows, but then you're just kind of wasting time. But the biggest problem with this is, like I was saying earlier, you're used to Windows. You have the software that you like to use on Windows, So really you're just going to be on Linux to mess around for a bit, and you're not going to find anything to do unless you have a specific requirement for Linux and for dual booting in general. Then you're just going to end up being on Windows most of the time, and you won't learn anything, and you'll probably end up just dropping Linux. Okay, so the next method is a Linux VM, and this isn't a bad option either, to be fair. It certainly has its use case. It doesn't interrupt your Windows workflow. You don't have to constantly be switching between Linux and Windows like you would be with a dual booting system if you required something in Windows. But while your Linux virtual machine is running, that's some system resources that you don't have access to. So not only is your Linux VM limited, but your Windows environment doesn't have as much resources available as it would if you weren't running a virtual machine. And that causes problems in and of itself. And when you're running Linux in a virtual machine, you don't get an experience for the full-fat Linux operating system. But has a similar problem with dual booting in that unless you have some specific requirement from Linux, then you're generally not going to use the VM that often. You know, you'll boot into Linux, you'll do stuff in the file manager, you might download a piece of software or two, but after a certain point you're just going to stop using it and drop it, basically. And that's just going to stagnate your learning, you're not really going to get anywhere with it. The one benefit that it does have over the other methods is that it's a good way to start learning about virtual machines though. I'm sure many of you are aware that virtual machines are commonplace within server environments. When you're talking about having huge multi-core Xeon systems, you're likely going to be running virtual machines a lot. That's kind of one of the big use cases for that sort of server equipment. So. And that's something that the enterprise likes to use, so knowing how to use a virtual machine, knowing what a virtual machine is, certainly isn't a bad thing, but I think there's better ways to learn that specific skill as well. So overall, it's not that effective of a method. But so that's the biggest problem with dual booting and running a Linux VM. It's kind of a common shortcoming of both methods is that unless there's something that you'd specifically need Linux for, you're not going to find reasons to be using Linux all the time, and you're not really going to learn that much. And anything you do learn, it's going to be slow and probably just not worth the hassle. Okay, so the next method I'm going to be talking about is replacing Windows entirely and going solely with a Linux on your main PC. This has a lot more advantages. It's a lot better than dual booting or running Linux in a VM as far as learning Linux goes. Because it forces you into a situation where you need to know how Linux works. So if something breaks or you need to do something, you're only using Linux, you don't have access to Windows, so you need to figure out a way to do it in Linux. So that forces you into learning some things. And because you can't switch back to Windows, it means you're not going to learn on what you're familiar with. So once again, it's kind of forcing you to learn Linux in a way. And thank you to Lord Gaben. It is now much easier to switch to Linux than it ever has been before. More software is available, and the software on Linux is getting better by the day. Lord Gaben has given us Steam Play, which now allows us to play almost any Windows game on Linux with slight performance degradation, for sure. It's not perfect, But the option's there, and there's a lot of games running on it, and it works pretty well. So that option's there. And even before that was a thing, there was a lot of games that were native to Linux that worked pretty well from my experience. And it means that you get Microsoft out of your life a lot sooner. You don't have them breathing down your neck, selling your information to advertising companies, or just being a general pain in the ass with updates and everything else that Windows has to offer. But biggest problem with this method is the learning curve itself is huge, and it puts a lot of pressure on you to learn Linux extremely quickly, which for some people is good. For me, it was good. It was good for me because I'm the type of person who likes to dive into the deep end and get straight into things and not really putter about too much. But while you're switching to Linux though, it will take you a while to be as productive as you were on Windows. Because you just have to get used to it. That's the reality of the situation, is you're not going to be able to jump straight in and know what you're doing straight away. There will be things to get used to. And it can be really easy or really complicated depending on what your setup is like and what your specific requirements are. But the biggest problem with this method is it's not quite as bad as with the Linux VM or dual booting. But once you have Linux set up, once you've got your browser installed, you've got some games installed and working, you're likely not to do anything radical with it that will further develop your learning. There's sort of a hard cap on just installing Linux on your desktop, because obviously when you're running your operating system daily, you want to be productive, you want to get shit done, you don't want to be fixing shit constantly. It means you're going to get to a point in Linux where everything's working, and you're not going to further your development in any way in learning Linux. You're basically just going to stagnate your learning, you're going to cap at a point. And that is one benefit dual booting or Linux VM has, is if you fuck up your Linux install, you have Windows there to lean on. But then obviously, without having a specific use for Linux, if you still have Windows around, you're not going to be learning much. So overall, those three methods, they do have their pros and cons, but they definitely aren't the most effective way to learn Linux. And I will be bringing you that most effective way right now. Now here's the big reveal. Here's everything you've been waiting for. The most effective way to learn Linux is to have yourself a dedicated Linux server. Now, don't be too worried by a dedicated Linux server. It's not like you have to have some fancy Xeon or something. I have a series on building yourself a Linux server for free using old desktops, which do a pretty good job, and you can see that in that series. But click on the iCard up in the top right hand corner, and there will be a link to the first part of that series now. But the reason why this is the most effective way, in my opinion, this is obviously from my opinion and what I think is the most effective way. Maybe the other methods would work for you. Maybe you could force yourself to find specific tasks you want to do in Linux with the other methods. But the reason why I think this is the best method is, one, it doesn't interrupt your Linux workflow. It doesn't take up any additional disk space on your system. It doesn't use resources. You're not likely to break something. It means your main PC stays stable and you can get shit done when you need to. With a dedicated Linux server, not only are you learning Linux, but you're going to be learning PC hardware. So maybe you're a PC builder, you're already fairly experienced with hardware, but a little more experience is never a bad thing. And if you've never built a PC before, you're just sort of using a laptop or a pre-built or something, and you haven't done much in the way of the hardware space, then it's a good way to get started. If you accidentally fuck up or brick an old Pentium 4 or Core 2 Duo, it's not a big deal. There's plenty around, and you're never going to run short of of the old desktops to make yourself a server with. But it also gives you a project, something to work towards. There's a specific use case for it that you can use Linux for, that you can't get just by running Linux on your desktop. It teaches you about networking and how you can network between Windows computers and Linux. Because running a Linux server doesn't mean you need to run Linux on your desktop to get the most out of it. You can still get plenty out of it on Windows, thanks to web applications as well as technologies that Linux has implemented that allows it to communicate with Windows. And it's free. Obviously I started off with that. It's kind of in the title of the series, but it's cheap, so it's something you can keep doing if you want to practice installing Linux over and over again, or you just want to do a bunch. You can make yourself as many servers as you want, and you can give them away to family if you want. Maybe they have a bunch of media that they want to keep stored somewhere safe and secure. They can use it as a backup server, or they have a bunch of DVDs and they want to have them much more easily accessible. So then you can rip all of the DVDs into a digital format and keep them on the server and use Plex for that. Oh, you might be skeptical about the how much you can do with them. Working within limitations of hardware is one way to... It teaches yourself to be resourceful. You don't always have a 50-core Xeon to do everything with. Sometimes you need to be able to accomplish a task with limited hardware, and there's no better way to teach yourself how to work through or work with limited hardware than using it. And if you build enough of them, give them all to your family, you can have yourself a cluster of old desktops to use for your computational needs as you need to. Now, this method has a lot of pros, but it isn't without its cons. So obviously running a second computer, you're going to be using more power than you would normally. It's not a big deal though. It's not like it's old desktops will be consuming 500 from the wall watts from the wall constantly. Usually about 200 to 300 watts at full load maximum. So when they're idling away, it's not going to be too bad, but that's something you have to consider, as there will be more power there. And as I was saying before, which it's kind of a pro but also kind of a con, is the older hardware does limit what projects you can do. But trying those projects and accomplishing them within the constraints of the hardware is rewarding in and of itself. Yeah, so that's what I think personally is the most effective way to learn Linux, is to have yourself a dedicated server. But it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It just needs to be a computer that you can install Linux on, run some software that essentially allows it to work as a server. It can be a file manager, it can be media server, you can have your own personal Netflix, and it's capable of quite a lot. I was freaking out at the end of that series about how good a Pentium 4 was at being a media server, because it could play 3 4K video feeds all at once without hiccups, and it could play a 4th with some stuttering here and there, and that's all at 4K. So you may think the hardware is limited, but it has its use case. It's still got life left in it, so there's definitely nothing wrong with that. But so yeah, you want to just go out, talk to people, get yourself some old desktops, bring them home, fix them up, install Linux on them, and yeah. And then maybe if you end up becoming dependent on your server and you don't want to potentially fuck it up with experimenting on projects, you just build yourself another one, because they're cheap and available. You can make yourself a LAMP stack, which is Apache, MySQL, and PHP, which is essentially a web server. You can start teaching yourself how to program in PHP at the same time as that, learn databases, you learn networking while you're doing all of this, because you need to be able to connect to your server, obviously. from your main PC, you chuck it in a cupboard and you don't have to worry about it. It's not noticeable or anything. It's just kind of leave it there and forget about it, and occasionally SSH into it and teach yourself Linux. Oh yeah, so that you can make yourself a web server, a lamp stack. You can do some just random computing tasks. It might be slow, but you just leave it in a cupboard to go 24/7, and it's not interrupting your personal workflow. Oh yeah, it's just don't let your limited hardware discourage you from trying projects. Overcome the limits of the hardware. Okay, so there you go. What I personally think is the most effective way to learn Linux. It's cheap. It's teaches you more than just Linux. It teaches you networking. You're not limited to the GUI because you're running purely a terminal. So and that's where Linux shines, is in the terminal. And if you're learning Linux because you want to try to get a job for it, it's probably the best method as well, purely from the fact that Linux in the enterprise is used primarily for servers. So running your own server is a good way to start learning Linux for an enterprise job. Yeah, so here's your start. Just this video gives you a jumping off place. My other series gets you started, and then go out there, search for tutorials, find projects to do, just fuck around, and since the hardware's old, you don't have to worry about fucking it up. You know, you don't have to worry about a multi-$1,000 computer bricking or anything like that. It teaches you about hardware and all this other stuff, so, you know, keep on hacking, never stop learning. I'll catch you guys later.